The generator behind my head has a knock in it that nobody else on this ship can hear anymore. I stopped hearing it myself around month 3. That is what 8 months on the Kairos does to you. It takes every strange sound the boat makes and files it under normal, until the only sounds left that mean anything are the new ones. I came aboard during the refit, back when the Kairos was still mostly a gutted hull with 3 of us and a punch list a mile long, and I was supposed to leave with the rest of the skeleton crew once the wiring passed inspection. It didn't pass. Not cleanly. Whoever did the rewiring before me had made decisions nobody wrote down, and by the time the science staff started asking why a breaker in the aft compartment tripped every time somebody ran the centrifuge, the program had decided it was cheaper to keep me than to find out what had actually been done to the boat. So I stayed. 8 months now, alone in a job that was supposed to be temporary, on a ship anchored over a hole in the ocean floor that nobody but the scientists cared about. The mooring is not really a mooring. It is tethers, sample lines running straight down several hundred meters into the vent field, and as long as those lines are in the water, we cannot move the ship without cutting 6 months of somebody's research loose into the dark. I used to think of that as a fact about the job, mentioned only to justify why the supply run takes 2 full days each way out of Guam. We are anchored. The radio room gets 1 window a day to talk to the mainland. None of it has ever struck me as a problem, because for 8 months, nothing has happened. The science rotation came aboard 9 strong 4 days ago, and with them came the paperwork. Nobody reads until it matters. The charter clause about berths, the one that says no cabin goes to 1 person alone, no watch stands solo, on account of 2 people who died on this ship back when it had a different name and a different owner. I have always treated that clause the way I treat the fire extinguisher inspection tags. Something that exists so a form somewhere can be filled out correctly. Which is how I ended up with Kyle James on the other side of a 6-foot gap of cabin floor. He came aboard with 1 duffel and a hard case for equipment, and by the time I got off shift and found him in there, he had already claimed his half of the room without leaving a trace of the process. Bunk made, duffel stowed flat under it, a single framed photograph turned face down on the shelf so I couldn't see who was in it. He looked up when I came in and said his name, and I said mine, and that was more or less the whole conversation. "Vent chemistry," he said, when I asked what brought a person out here. "Lower lab." I said something about the smell down there, the sulfur that gets into everything no matter how good the ventilation is. And he looked at me like I'd told him something he already knew and had already stopped minding. He is not unfriendly. He answers what you ask him. He just never gives you anything past the edge of the question, and he never asks anything back. A week in, I still don't know where he's from, only that when he talks, there's a shape to his words that isn't local to anywhere I've been, some kind of accent worn down by years of talking to Americans, until it's mostly gone and only shows up on certain vowels. He doesn't complain about the bunks, which are hard, or the food, which is worse than it should be for what this program pays. He doesn't do small talk. He sets his boots by the door heel to toe, exactly aligned every night, and every morning they're gone before I'm fully awake. That part I noticed early. The first few nights I came off the late watch and his side of the room was full, him asleep or reading with a small light clipped to the shelf edge so it wouldn't wake me. Then it started being empty. I'd come in at midnight, sometimes later, and his bunk would be flat and made and he would not be in it. And in the morning he'd be at breakfast like he'd slept 8 hours in a bed I never saw him occupy. I asked him about it exactly once. "Lab hours keeping you up?" "Something like that," he said, and didn't look up from what he was doing, and I let it go, because vent chemists keep whatever hours the chemistry demands, and it isn't my business to police a man's sleep schedule. I've got my own hours. Half of what I do happens after the science crew's gone to bed, because that's when I can get into a breaker panel without somebody yelling that the centrifuge just died. It made sense to me that our schedules would cross without lining up. It made sense right up until it didn't feel like it made sense anymore, and even then, I didn't say anything. Tonight is one of those nights. I come off shift a little after 11, tired in the specific way that comes from an hour spent on my knees in the aft compartment, chasing a ground fault that turned out to be nothing. And the cabin door is unlocked, and the light is off, and Kyle's side of the room is empty again. Made bed. Boots gone. The photograph still face down on the shelf where he keeps it, same as every night. I lie down in my bunk and listen to the ship breathe the way it always breathes at this hour. The generators knock, the tick of the hull cooling, water somewhere against the plating far below. The space across the cabin stays quiet and still and unoccupied, and I tell myself what I've told myself all week, lying there in the dark with my eyes open a while longer than they need to be. It isn't my business. The emergency systems check is supposed to take 20 minutes. I've done it enough times now that my hands know it before my head does. The fire suppression lines, the backup breakers for the winch motors, the oxygen reserve down at the end of the corridor where the deck plating gets slick from condensation and somebody's always meant to put down a mat and never has. I checked the reserve gauge on a Tuesday because Tuesday was the day it fell on the rotation, and it read low. Not alarmingly low. If you didn't know what the number should be, you wouldn't look twice. But I'd been logging these since before the science crew came aboard, back when it was just refit work and a skeleton maintenance detail and nothing better to do at the end of a shift than get to know a system cold. And I knew what the number should be for the elapsed time and 9 people breathing. This wasn't that number. It was close enough to make me doubt myself, and far enough to make me write it down anyway. Possible slow leak, recheck in 48 hours. And I told myself that was the end of it. Static systems leak. Seals age. It happens on ships older than this one, and it happens on ships newer. 48 hours later, I came back with my phone out. The gauge was lower again. Not by much. But a slow leak from a sealed static line doesn't behave like that. It finds its level and it stays there, or it drops off fast once the seal really goes. This was neither. This was a straight, even patient line going down like something on the other end knew exactly how much it was allowed to take and took it anyway, every day, on schedule. I photographed the gauge face first, close enough to catch the needle and the numbers stamped along the dial. Then I stepped back and got the whole panel in frame with the little date stamp readout above it, because I wanted a record that couldn't be argued with later. This is what it said. This is when it said it. Then I got down on one knee and checked the seal around the access panel itself, running my thumb along the gasket the way you'd check a tire for a slow puncture, feeling for the give that means something's been pried at. Nothing. Clean bead all the way around. Same grease pencil mark I'd made myself back in the refit to know if it had ever been opened. It hadn't. I went up to the maintenance terminal after that and pulled the automated access log for the reserve line. There's a record for everything on this ship that matters. Every valve, every breaker, every hatch with a sensor on it, logged to the minute, and Scott reads that report every morning with his coffee like it's scripture. The reserve line showed nothing. No access, no fault code, no maintenance flag. As far as the ship's own memory was concerned, nobody had touched that gauge since the day it was installed, which left me standing in a quiet corridor at the end of a shift with a gauge that was lying to physics and a computer that swore nothing had happened. I bought a logbook from the equipment stores that same week, the kind with the hard cover and the graph paper pages, meant for engine hours, and I didn't tell anyone I'd bought it. I started writing the numbers down at the same time every day, late morning, right after the systems check, because a measurement is only worth something if you take it the same way twice. For 2 weeks, that's what I did. Late morning, down the corridor, gauge, photograph, seal check, log. The drain held its shape the whole time. Not faster, not slower, no weekend where it caught its breath and came back to normal. No spike that would have meant a real failure somewhere I could point to and fix. Something on this ship was pulling oxygen out of the emergency reserve at a rate somebody had chosen, and whatever it wasn't leaving so much as a fingerprint anywhere Scott would ever have reason to look. I ran through every explanation I had. A slow leak doesn't hold a line like a metronome. A sensor fault reads wrong in both directions, drifts, doesn't march downward with this kind of discipline. A miscalibration would have shown up the first week and stayed put, not kept sliding. None of it fit all the facts at once. And I've learned enough about this ship's wiring, rewired in the refit in ways nobody wrote down properly, patched by whoever had the tools that week, to know that when something doesn't fit, it usually means a person did it on purpose and didn't want it found. Tonight I sit on the edge of my bunk with the logbook open on my knee, running my thumb down the column of numbers the way I checked that gasket, looking for the place where it stops making sense and not finding one. 14 entries, 14 dates, 14 times, all late morning, all mine. Nobody else on this ship knows this page exists. I close the logbook and slide it under the mattress, into the gap by the frame where it fits flat and out of sight, and I lie back and stare at the ceiling with the numbers still running in my head, in order, the way they've run every night for 2 weeks now, refusing to add up to anything I can name. I woke because the light was wrong. The overhead was off, but the desk lamp was on, throwing a hard yellow circle across the far wall, and it took me a second lying there in the dark to understand that the shape sitting inside that circle was Kyle, and the thing open under his hands was my logbook. I came up on one elbow. "What are you doing?" He didn't startle. He didn't even move fast. He looked up at me the way a man looks up from a piece of paperwork he's almost finished with, closed the cover over the graph paper pages, and set it flat on the desk with both hands still resting on top of it, like he wanted me to see exactly where it was. "I have been watching you for 2 weeks," he said. "The gauge, the panel, the photographs, this." He tapped the cover once. "I know you have worked out that the reserve is being drained. I want to know what you plan to do about it." I sat all the way up. My mouth was dry and my heart was doing something too fast for 2 in the morning, and the only thing I could get out was the obvious question. "How do you know all that?" "Because I am the one doing it." He said it the way he said everything, flat, unhurried, no weight on any particular word, and that flatness was worse than if he'd shouted it. His didn't cost him anything I could see. "Let me explain," he said, "before you do anything." I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I just sat there on the edge of my bunk in my t-shirt with my bare feet on the cold deck, and he took that for permission, which maybe it was. "The reserve is not being drained to nothing," he said. "It is being cycled. I rigged a secondary line off the main vent chemistry lab. It feeds a buffer zone around the sample vault, down in the lower lab. Keeps that buffer at a slightly elevated pressure. I did not run it off the official oxygen lines because the official lines log automatically. It would have shown up on Scott's daily systems report, and I did not want it to show up." "Why not?" "I will get to that." He said it without impatience, like a man laying out steps he'd already numbered in his head. "The samples off-gas, trace sulfur compounds as they equilibrate in storage. In a sealed vault. Ours is a Meridian Series 4, same as 2 other facilities I know of, that off-gassing builds pressure over time if nobody is managing the buffer around it. Slowly, but it builds. So you're venting our air into a wall to keep sample jars from swelling." "To keep the vault from failing," he said, and something in his face tightened, just slightly, the first give I'd seen in him since he sat down. 2 vaults, at 2 other facilities. This same model failed from exactly this, before this rotation. I found the incident reports last year in an internal archive, through a contact at one of the programs. Both times it was covered up. Nobody outside the program office ever heard about either one. "Covered up by who?" He looked at me steadily. "If the feed stops, the buffer equalizes over 6 to 8 days. After that, you have a contained failure, which loses 6 months of samples, or an uncontained one, which vents sulfur gas into the lab corridor at a concentration that puts people in a hospital bed." "You didn't answer me." "I am answering you. He folded his hands on top of my logbook, over my own 2 weeks of numbers. Why did I not bring this to Scott? Because Scott is the person who signed off on suppressing both of those reports. Going to him is not a solution, Alexander. Going to him is the problem. He didn't say it like an accusation. He said it the way he'd said everything else, like a reading off a gauge, a fact that had already been checked twice and confirmed and no longer needed defending. I didn't sleep again after that. I lay back down because there wasn't anywhere else in the cabin to be, and I stared at the underside of the bunk above me while Kyle turned the lamp off and, as far as I could tell in the dark, lay down himself, breathing the same even breaths he always breathed, like he'd set something heavy down and felt lighter for it. I ran it forward and backward until it stopped meaning anything, the drain in the gauge holding its line for 2 weeks straight, no leak in the world that patient, no sensor fault that disciplined, and now a man 6 feet from me claiming he'd built the discipline into it on purpose, for a reason specific enough to have a model number and a manufacturer and 2 buried reports behind it. I watched the porthole go from black to the flat gray that comes before any color does, and I still didn't have anything, not a decision, not even a guess I trusted enough to call a guess. Kyle asked me not to go. He said it once, flat, over breakfast, watching me instead of the tray in front of him. Do not go to Scott with this. I went anyway. His cabin sat at the forward end of the upper deck, a door that looked like every other door on the Kairos except for the little brass plate someone had screwed to it years before any of us came aboard. Inside it was half bunk and half office, a cot made with hospital corners on one side, a metal desk bolted to the floor on the other, charts and manifests stacked square at the edges like he measured them. He had me sit before I'd finished knocking. I laid it out the way I'd have logged a fault. The gauge readings, dated, timed, the photographs on my phone, the seal on the access panel, the maintenance log with nothing in it, then Kyle's version, the buffer zone, the vault, the 2 other facilities, the reports that never made it anywhere Holmes would have to answer for them. I said Meridian Series 4 out loud like it meant something to him. It did. I watched it land and not move a single muscle in his face. He let me get all the way to the end. He didn't interrupt once, didn't ask a question, just sat with his hands folded on the desk the way Kyle had sat with them folded over my logbook 2 nights before. And when I finished, he was quiet long enough that I thought maybe he was deciding how to say I was right. Kyle James was removed from a rotation at a research station in the Pacific 18 months ago, he said, for unsanctioned equipment modifications. It wasn't quiet. There's a file on him you haven't seen. That doesn't change what the gauge is doing. It changes what weight I put on his explanation for it. He said it evenly, the way he'd have read out a weather window. Alexander, if you file this as a formal report, the charter requires me to open a safety investigation into the reserve. That's not discretionary. A safety investigation puts a hold on all data collection until it clears. A hold voids the season's window. Voiding the window costs the program its renewal, and the renewal is already conditional on this rotation's output. And the vault? Let me handle Kyle, quietly. Keep your log to yourself for now. He leaned back, and something in his face settled into the look of a man closing a drawer. This is the version that protects the work everyone on this ship has spent 6 months building toward. I'd think carefully before you throw that away over a theory a chemist told you at 2 in the morning. He never once said the word vault after that. Never said Meridian, never said the reports, never said 6 days or 8. I sat there with my phone still open to the photograph of the panel, and I understood, somewhere on the walk back down the passage, that I had not said a single one of the things I'd meant to say when I sat down. Kyle was at the desk when I came in, and he didn't ask how it went. He already knew, the way he seemed to already know most things before they'd finished happening to the rest of us. He's not going to do anything, I said. No. He said he'd handle it quietly. That is not the same thing as handling it. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I still couldn't read after 5 weeks of trying. What are you going to do? I didn't have an answer. He waited long enough to confirm that I didn't, and then he went back to whatever he'd been writing before I walked in. I spent the next 2 days turning it over on watch, in the engine spaces, lying in my bunk with the light off, listening to Kyle's even breathing on the other side of the cabin. Cut the line, and I'd stopped an unauthorized man from bleeding the ship's emergency air for reasons nobody outside that cabin had verified. Leave it running, and I was trusting a stranger's arithmetic over 8 months of knowing exactly where every wire on this boat actually went. I pulled the equipment manifest out of the maintenance files on the second afternoon and found it in under a minute. Meridian Series 4, manufactured 2019, installed the last time the Kairos went into refit. Kyle hadn't guessed at a number to make himself sound credible. It was the actual unit, sitting in the actual lower lab, 6 decks below where we ate dinner. That should have settled something. It didn't. I went to George first, because he always said things plainly. I gave him the shape of it without the names, a modification to the oxygen reserve, unauthorized, possibly holding off a hazard in the sealed vault, possibly not. Reported outside Holmes's chain, George said immediately, like I'd handed him a checklist. That's what the external safety officer exists for. You don't sit on something like that. Megan took longer, turning her mug in both hands before she answered. The cleanest way through this is to put whoever's doing it off at the next supply drop and reverse the modification before it becomes a formal incident, she said, quietly, before it's something anyone outside this ship has to write a report about. Neither of them asked me how long it would take the vault to become dangerous if the modification stopped. I didn't tell them it was 6 to 8 days. I walked back to my cabin past the corridor to the lower lab, past the vault door I now knew the model number of. George and Megan were each holding half of something and calling it whole. I was the only person aboard who could see the whole shape of it, and I had told no one. The late watch ran long that night, and by the time I came off it, my hands were stiff from the cold on the aft deck. I let myself into the cabin expecting nothing more than sleep. The desk drawer was open an inch, which it never was. My bunk had been stripped back at the corner, the mattress shoved half off the frame like someone had lifted it and let it drop. I checked under it anyway. I checked the storage locker, both shelves, the space behind my spare coveralls. The logbook was not in any of those places, and there was no place left to check. I sat on the edge of the bunk and thumbed my phone awake to pull up the access panel photographs. If the book was gone, the photographs were still proof I could put in front of somebody. The library opened empty. Not deleted and recoverable empty. Empty like it had never held anything. Dates reset, thumbnails gone. Nothing in the trash folder because there was no trash folder. I tried the cloud backup out of habit and got a spinner that never resolved, because out here there was no signal for it to resolve against. A remote wipe doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone with the authority to reach into a device does it on purpose, and there was exactly one person on the Kairos with that kind of reach into the platform network. I knew that the way I knew the wiring in the engine room, because I'd been the one who mapped what the refit crew never documented, and Holmes's admin credentials were part of that map. I put the phone in my pocket and went up to his cabin. The door was open when I got there, which struck me even through the anger, because Holmes kept that door shut as a matter of habit, the same way he kept his shirt collared at 2 a.m. on an oil platform in the middle of the ocean. He was sitting behind the little fold-out desk that did for administration, and George was standing near the bunk with his arms crossed, and neither one of them looked surprised to see me. Alexander, Holmes said, like he'd been expecting to say my name at some point tonight, and here it was. My logbook is gone. My phone's been wiped. I didn't dress it up. You're the only one aboard who can do that. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He folded his hands on the desk in front of him. There's been an incident, he said. 20 minutes ago. George found Kyle in the corridor outside the lower lab. I looked at George. His knuckles were red on the right hand, and he wasn't looking at them. "A shoving match," Holmes said. Megan pulled them apart before it went further, but not before George connected. Kyle's lip is split. He's retreated into the chemistry lab. The door's shut. "You hit him," I said to George. "He's been running an unauthorized modification on a safety-critical system," George said, fast, like the words were already loaded before I got there. "I went to Holmes because that's what you do when somebody's compromising the ship. I told him what you told me, minus the names, and he already knew who it was." Holmes let that sit for a second before he came back in. "I need you to confirm the account to the rest of the crew," he said. "That James made an unauthorized modification to a safety-critical system. That the modification represents a deliberate hazard. That his removal at the next supply drop is the appropriate response." He said it in the same voice he used for weather updates. "This is the version that protects the program." He looked at me and waited, the way he waited for a man to sign something. George was watching me too, waiting on the same thing from a different direction, wanting the confirmation that would let him feel like the hand he'd already used had landed on the right person. I didn't say anything. There wasn't a sentence in me that fit what either of them wanted, and I wasn't going to build one just to fill the silence. I thought about the 6 to 8 days Kyle had given me, and about how long it had already been since he'd been locked in that lab with no way to touch the line he'd rigged to keep the buffer fed, and the arithmetic of it moved through me faster than any answer I could have given out loud. I turned around and walked out past George, past the open door, back into the corridor and toward the stairs down to the lower lab, and neither of them said a word to stop me. The passage down there was quiet at that hour, the overhead lights doing their steady hum, the vault door at the far end sitting closed the way it always sat closed. Somewhere past it, behind a second door that was never meant to keep anyone in, Kyle was sitting in the dark with a split lip and no way to reach the switch that mattered, and the reserve I'd been tracking for 5 weeks had been running on nothing for however long that lock had held. I knocked on the chemistry lab door twice and said my name into the seam of it, the way you'd talk to someone through a wall you weren't sure was thick or thin. Nothing for a second. Then the latch turned and the door came open a few inches, and Kyle was standing there in the dark with his lips split down the middle and swollen out past the line of it, dried blood gone black at the corner of his mouth. He hadn't turned on a single light in the room behind him. "They took my logbook," I told him. "Wiped my phone. George already went to Holmes, and Holmes has a story built for him, and I don't have anything left to put against it. The only thing left is the vault itself. The readings. We go now." He looked at me for a beat that felt longer than it was, and then he reached back into the dark of the lab without turning around, and came up with a stack of pages, handwritten, folded once down the middle, and stepped out past me into the corridor light like he'd been waiting on someone to say exactly that. The corridor wasn't empty. 3 of the science crew were already down there, pulled out of their bunks by whatever noise the shoving match had made 20 minutes earlier, standing in a loose, unsure cluster, waiting for someone to tell them what had happened. George came down from the direction of Holmes's cabin with his shoulders still up around his ears, and Holmes came behind him, slower, like a man arriving at a meeting he intended to run. Kyle didn't look at either of them. He went straight to the monitoring panel on the wall outside the lab, popped the cover with his thumbnail, and pointed. The numbers weren't subtle. Even to me, and I'd only ever read that panel in passing, the line was climbing in a way that had nothing patient about it. "That's within normal operating range," Holmes said. He said it the way he said everything, flat and certain, a man reading a weather report. Nobody in the corridor moved to agree or disagree with him. They just watched the numbers, the way you watch a fire before you decide whether to call it that. Megan came forward out of the loose cluster and looked at the display for maybe 3 seconds. "That is not within normal range," she said. "I worked with this exact vault model at a station in Okinawa. I know where the ceiling is before it risks containment." That number is past it, and it's still climbing. Nobody said anything after that. The 3 crew members standing there looked at Holmes, and then they looked at Megan, and then back at Holmes, like the answer might arrive on a second pass. Holmes turned to me instead. "Take him to his cabin. Lock him in." I didn't move. He crossed the distance between us in 2 steps and closed his hand around my arm above the elbow, and I pulled it free before I'd decided to. He didn't have his balance set for that. He went back a step and caught the monitoring panel with his shoulder, and the display cable came loose from its socket with a small plastic click, and the screen behind Kyle's fingers went dark. Nobody in that corridor could read the vault now. The only way left was the access port itself. Bleed the buffer pressure out through the exhaust line, then reach in with a handheld sensor and take the number by hand. And the blast doors that sealed the lower lab, the doors you had to go through to get anywhere near that port, opened for exactly 1 key, and that key was in Holmes's pocket. He didn't take it out. He didn't move toward the doors at all. Kyle held up the folded pages in his hand, not reading from them, just holding them like a thing that existed. The pressure was already past the ceiling before that display went dark, he said, in the same voice he'd have used to read a thermometer. "The vault has had no oxygen feed for the whole time I was locked in that lab. At the rate it was climbing, we have somewhere between 36 and 50 hours before it fails." Megan didn't wait to be asked. "I saw the same climb on the display before it cut out. His number matches what I saw." She looked at Holmes, not at Kyle, when she said the rest of it. "If that vault fails uncontained, the off-gas goes straight into this corridor. The blast doors are the only things standing between that and the rest of the ship." Holmes didn't answer her. He stood there long enough that everyone in the corridor stopped waiting for someone to speak and started watching to see what he'd do with his hands. What he did was reach into his pocket and bring out the key. He didn't hold it out to Kyle. He held it out to me. I took it, and I turned, and I put it in Kyle's hand. Kyle took the key and turned toward the blast door without a word, his handwritten notes folded in his other hand. The blast doors took Kyle 4 minutes to seal once he had the key, and after that he stopped looking at any of us and started looking at his notes. They were handwritten, folded twice, soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded a lot of times before tonight. He read from them anyway, careful not to skip a line. "Buffer zone first," he said. "Vent to the external exhaust, port side, in stages. Not all at once. If we drop it too fast, we get a pressure differential across the vault housing we don't want." Nobody argued with him. George stood against the corridor wall with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and Holmes stood behind everyone with his hands in his pockets, and Megan moved up next to Kyle like she'd done this before, because she had. It took 40 minutes just to get the exhaust line staged the way Kyle wanted it. He had me holding a valve wheel a quarter turn open while he watched a gauge I didn't understand, and he'd say wait, and then he'd say now, and I'd give it another quarter turn, and the whole time his split lip was still bleeding a little at one corner and he didn't wipe it. When the port finally opened and he put the handheld sensor through, the corridor went very quiet. Megan read the number off the display before Kyle could say anything. "That's a 40-hour number," she said. Then, flatter, like she was correcting herself for precision, 40 hours from right now, at that concentration, this fails uncontained." Nobody said anything to that. Holmes had come up near the back of the group, and I looked over at him once, and he was just standing there with his hands still in his pockets, watching the display like it was someone else's problem. The next 6 hours were the exhaust cycle, done in stages Kyle had written down before any of us knew there was anything to write down for. Vent, hold, check the sensor, vent again. He didn't rest. Nobody else really did either. Megan tracked the readings on a second handheld unit and called them out every 10 minutes without being asked. And George, to his credit, ran cable and held lines and didn't say a word the whole 6 hours. Somewhere around hour 5, the number started coming down instead of going up, and I watched something in Kyle's shoulders let go. By the time he closed the port and resealed the buffer zone, it was almost morning. He ran the oxygen feed back through the official line himself, no hesitation. Holmes had already gone. I hadn't seen him leave. He was just not there anymore, and none of us mentioned it. I didn't go to the communication room that day. I had no reason to. It didn't occur to me that I needed one until Megan told me, 2 days later, that Holmes had used the scheduled transmission window that same morning, within the hour of the exhaust line going quiet, and that whatever he sent, none of us had read it. 2 days after that, Megan came and found me on the aft deck. "I contacted someone in the Guam office," she said. "You should hear what I found." She told me flatly, no softening on either end of it. Kyle had been placed on a blacklist the Pacific programs kept between themselves, the kind that follows a person from ship to ship without ever needing a hearing. The grounds were willful interference with safety systems. No vault, no pressure readings, no mention of a Meridian Series 4 or 2 other facilities that had already lost containment the same way and buried it. No mention of Holmes at all. "That's it," I said. "That's the whole record." "That's the whole record," she said, and didn't add anything to soften it because there wasn't anything to add. I went back to the cabin that night and went through it anyway, checking for something I already knew I wouldn't find. I went through the drawer under my bunk. I went through the pockets of the coveralls I'd worn that week, in case some scrap of paper had fallen out of the logbook before it disappeared. A torn corner, a receipt with numbers scrawled on the back. There was nothing. I checked the maintenance terminal in the equipment locker and pulled the automated log for the reserve system going back 6 weeks, and it showed exactly what it had always shown, which was nothing, because Kyle's line had never touched the part of the system that log was built to watch. The vault emergency itself was in there, logged, time-stamped, authorized, under Holmes's name, filed the way you'd file a scheduled maintenance action, a precaution taken in the ordinary course of things. Nothing in it read like 6 hours of a crew standing in a corridor watching a number that meant people in the hospital if it kept climbing. I picked my phone up off the desk and opened the photo library out of habit more than hope, and it opened onto nothing, the folder empty the way it had been since the day it was wiped. I stood there holding it, in the cabin Kyle didn't sleep in anymore, and understood that there was no version of what had happened left anywhere on the ship except the one Holmes had written down. I woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of an engine that shouldn't have been there. The supply boat wasn't due for another 6 days, and even when it was due, it never came in the dark. It came in the afternoon, when the light was good and there were hands free to help with the crates. This one came in from the northeast, while the sky was still the color of a bruise, running lights low and steady, and by the time I got up to the porthole it was already alongside, tying off, no announcement made over the ship's system, no word passed at the morning briefing that hadn't happened yet. 2 men came aboard. I didn't know them, and they didn't offer their names. They went up to Holmes's cabin first, and they were in there something like 15 minutes, long enough for me to get dressed and stand in the corridor not knowing what I was waiting for. And then they came out and Holmes didn't come with them, and they walked down to the cabin I still, technically, shared with Kyle. Kyle was awake. I think he'd been awake before the engine noise reached us. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk when the 2 men came in, and he looked at them the way he looked at a gauge reading, not startled, just taking a measurement. He didn't argue with them. He didn't ask what this was about or say he wanted to call someone or ask for 5 minutes. He reached under his bunk and pulled out the same bag he'd carried aboard 5 weeks before, and it took him under a minute to put into it everything he'd taken out of it, because he'd never taken out much. I said his name. It came out flatter than I meant it to. He looked at me once, and there was nothing in his face I could read, which by then I understood was not the same as there being nothing there. "Take care of the readings," he said. "Someone has to keep taking them." Then he walked past me, past the 2 men who fell in beside him without touching him, and out into the corridor, and I followed as far as the deck hatch because that was as far as anyone let me go. The deck was gray and wet and empty except for the four of them walking across it, unhurried, like men crossing a parking lot. I stood in the hatch with the cold coming off the water and watched Kyle go up the gangway and onto the boat without once turning around. Not at the rail, not at the stern. He never looked back at the ship or at me. The boat pulled off before the watch changed. I stood at that hatch until its lights were a single point and then nothing, until the horizon was just horizon again. Gray meeting gray, and the only sound left was the water working against the hull and, far below it, out past where I could see, the tethers running down into the dark, holding the ship exactly where it was. At the morning briefing, Holmes stood at the front of the room with his hands folded in front of him the way he always stood, and told the room that Kyle James had been removed from the rotation for making an unauthorized modification to a safety-critical system. He said the matter had been referred to the program office and was closed. He didn't say vault. He didn't say buffer pressure or off gas or 40 hours. He said closed, and he said it the way he said everything, like a door settling into a frame, and nobody in that room had a reason to think there was anything on the other side of it. I sat at the back and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left in my hands to say it with. I went through the rest of that day on the schedule the ship runs on regardless of what happens to the people on it, and in the evening, after the watch, I went out to the stern deck by myself. The tethers ran straight down off the stern into black water, taut, patient, exactly as they had for 8 months. The reason this ship could not turn its bow toward Guam, even if every single person aboard wanted it to. Somewhere below the horizon, on schedule, there was a satellite window opening for the day's single outgoing block, the same rationed thread Holmes had used 2 days before to send whatever he'd sent, and I had no way of knowing what had gone out on it, and no way of putting anything of my own on the next one that would matter more than his had. I had no photographs. I had no logbook. I had 2 people who'd give me half a true thing each and neither of them a whole one, and I had a director whose version was now the only version filed anywhere on this ship or off it. I went down to the equipment stores and found a spare notebook in a box of them, blank, the cardboard cover still stiff, and I brought it back up to the stern deck and sat down with my back against the rail housing where the light from the passageway reached just far enough to write by. I started with the first gauge reading, the date, the number, the way it had sat lower than it should have for the crew, and the days elapsed. I wrote the second reading 2 days after that, and the word leak, and then the word wrong, because a leak doesn't drain like that. I wrote Meridian Series 4. I wrote the words Holmes had said in his office about program disruption and funding renewal, as close to word for word as I could get them. I wrote the words Kyle had said at 2 a.m. with my logbook open in front of him, because I am the one doing it. And I wrote them exactly like that, because that was exactly how he'd said it. I wrote the number Megan had read off the sensor display, the one that would have caused a failure inside 40 hours, and I wrote her name next to it because she was the one who'd said it, and someone should know that. I wrote down the 2 men who never gave their names. Then I wrote down the boat pulling away from the hull in the gray before dawn, and Kyle walking up the gangway without turning his head, not at the rail, not once, all the way until the lights went small, and then went out. I kept the pen moving after that. There wasn't a reason to stop. Nobody was going to read it, and nobody was going to sign their name under mine, and it wouldn't open a hold or trigger an investigation or put a single word in front of the program office that mattered to them. But it was mine, written the way I remembered it happening, and out on the black water the tethers held the ship fast to the one place on Earth it could not leave, and I sat there in the cold with the notebook open on my knee, writing it down anyway.